For decades, Greenland was a quiet word in global politics. Remote, icy, strategically important, but politically invisible. Then one sentence changed the temperature. The President of the United States said he wanted it, not cooperation, not access, control. And suddenly something rare happened in Washington. Members of Congress from both parties began preparing not for expansion but for restraint. Bills were drafted, emergency meetings were called, not to challenge a rival power, but to prevent damage to America's own alliance system. This is not just a story about an island. It is a story about how power speaks and how institutions respond when words alone begin to sound like threats. If you want more analysis that cuts through the noise and explains what actually matters beneath the headlines, stay with me, because before we can understand where this is going, we need to be clear about what exactly is at stake and why Greenland became the spark. And that takes us to the deeper question behind this confrontation. At the center of this confrontation is a simple but dangerous collision of ideas. On one side, a president framing geography as leverage, on the other, an alliance built on consent, sovereignty, and trust. Greenland is not a blank space on a map. It is a Danish territory. It is part of NATO, and its people have a say. That is why Trump's repeated refusal to rule out a military option landed like a shockwave, not in Copenhagen alone, but inside the US Congress itself. Lawmakers did not hear strategy, they heard risk. Risk to NATO's core principle that borders are not altered by pressure, risk to American credibility, already strained, and risk that a rhetorical gambit could turn into an irreversible crisis. This explains the urgency, why senators rushed to Denmark, why bills were floated to block funding for an invasion of an ally, why words like strategic self-harm entered the conversation. But to understand why this idea emerged at all, why Greenland, why now we need to step back, because this moment did not appear out of nowhere. To understand this moment, you have to widen the lens. Greenland has always existed at the edge of great power imagination. During the Cold War, it was a shield, a northern warning system between Washington and Moscow. What changed is not the island, it is the cycle of power politics. As competition intensifies, geography regains value. Arctic routes matter again. Early warning infrastructure matters again. And in moments like this, leaders start thinking in terms of control rather than cooperation. Trump's framing fits a pattern. He speaks about security in absolute terms. Either the United States has leverage or someone else does. Nuance disappears. Allies begin to look uncomfortably like assets. But the international system was not built for that logic. NATO is not an empire. It is a voluntary compact held together by trust and restraint. When a president suggests buying or seizing allied territory, the system reacts defensively, not out of ideology but self-preservation. And that reaction set the stage for the first real rupture, because soon words turned into something harder to contain. The rupture came quickly. On one hand, Trump continued to escalate, making clear that a military option was still on the table. On the other, Congress moved faster than ever to head it off. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska convened an emergency meeting of the Arctic Caucus. Senators like Mitch McConnell and Tom Tillis joined her, publicly rejecting the idea of military force. Their message was simple. Greenland is not an acquisition, it is an ally. What followed was the introduction of a bill that seemed impossible only weeks earlier. A bill to block funds for a U.S. invasion of any NATO ally. This wasn't just about Greenland. It was a statement that no NATO member, no matter how small, no matter how remote, would be the subject of coercion. The stakes were set, the rhetoric had crossed a line, and now every word and every step would be scrutinized, not just in Washington, but in the capitals of Europe. But while Congress took action, the other side of the Atlantic was also reacting, because as it turned out, Trump's pursuit of Greenland wasn't just a dispute with Denmark. It was shaking the very foundations of Europe's security. The next chapter of this story has only just begun. Europe's response was swift and predictable. For them, this was not merely about one president's desire to control an island. It was about the entire post-war order, one that had relied on the idea that no NATO ally could be threatened by its own partners. French President Emmanuel Macron called the idea of a US takeover unprecedented, and he was right. The ramifications of such a move would be far-reaching. Greenland is part of NATO. An American military occupation would trigger an existential crisis in the alliance itself. The very core of NATO collective defense could be shattered by a single decision, no matter how far-fetched. Trump's approach to Greenland was becoming not just a policy dispute, but a warning sign. As the diplomatic pressure mounted, Denmark's position remained clear. Greenland's territorial integrity was non-negotiable, and they would not bend to US demands for control. But the United States, too, was dealing with its own contradiction. In an alliance system built on trust, this situation exposed a fracture. Trump's rhetoric, though dismissed by some in the public eye, was now creating a real diplomatic rift, and it was clear that both sides would need to act, not just to avoid an international disaster, but to redefine how the world should handle power in the 21st century. So the question remains, where does this lead us? The darkest timeline would see the rupture of trust between NATO allies. If the US persists in its aggressive rhetoric or military posturing, Denmark could be forced to choose between maintaining its sovereignty and preserving its relationship with the United States. In this scenario, Greenland would no longer be the focal point. The real damage would be to the larger security architecture that has kept Europe and North America safe for generations. This would set a dangerous precedent for international relations, where powerful nations no longer respect their alliances but seek to dominate them instead. No matter which path we take, the world is watching, and the choices made in the coming months will resonate far beyond Greenland's frozen shores. The challenge isn't just about one island, it's about how we want to shape the future of global cooperation, and whether we can preserve the values that have kept peace in the West for so long. But as we look ahead, one thing is certain: the world is entering a new era, and we must choose the kind of future we want to build. For many, this conflict feels distant, cold, almost abstract, but its consequences will ripple out into every corner of global life. When a superpower threatens the sovereignty of a NATO ally, it's not just a political game, it's a personal issue for the people who live under the umbrella of that security. It's the family in Greenland wondering how much longer they can trust their government. It's the families across Europe asking, what happens if NATO crumbles? This is not about politicians in Washington or Copenhagen alone. It's about the everyday citizens who will bear the weight of any instability that follows. They are the ones who will feel the repercussions, whether through increased military presence, disrupted trade, or even the very fabric of international relations being torn apart. The stakes aren't just strategic, they're deeply human. And as this crisis threatens to unravel, the effects are not confined to the Arctic. The entire international order could be reshaped. If the US pushes its interests at the expense of its allies, it will send a signal to the world that alliances are negotiable, that the foundation of shared defense can be weakened by the whims of one leader. Europe is watching, and so is Asia. From Beijing to Moscow, leaders are closely observing the fallout from this dispute. If one NATO ally can be targeted like this, could others be next? The global balance of power is fragile, and moments like this, though seemingly local, have far-reaching consequences. This is the true impact of Trump's Greenland saga, a reminder that what happens in one corner of the world can reshape entire global alliances. Now we must ask, what happens next? The road ahead isn't a simple one, and it stretches in three distinct directions. Each path holds its own risks, but also opportunities. The best-case scenario, the most optimistic outcome, would see a negotiated resolution where the US and Denmark find common ground on security cooperation in Greenland without compromising sovereignty. In this scenario, the US gains greater military presence in the Arctic, Denmark maintains control, and the NATO alliance remains intact. But this requires diplomatic finesse and a commitment to mutual respect. It would mean that, at least for now, the tensions that erupted over Greenland were only a brief flash in an otherwise stable relationship. The middle ground, a more likely scenario, might involve continued diplomatic tensions but no full rupture. Greenland becomes a point of friction, but both sides agree to maintain an open dialogue. There may be an increase in military presence, but only through consensus, and Greenland's territorial integrity remains respected. In this case, the US and NATO would move forward with caution, trying to keep the peace while managing a simmering disagreement that could flare up again down the line. The worst-case scenario, the darkest timeline, would see the rupture of trust between NATO allies. If the US persists in its aggressive rhetoric or military posturing, Denmark could be forced to choose between maintaining its sovereignty and preserving its relationship with the United States. In this scenario, Greenland would no longer be the focal point. The real damage would be to the larger security architecture that has kept Europe and North America safe for generations. This would set a dangerous precedent for international relations, where powerful nations no longer respect their alliances but seek to dominate them instead. As we look to the future, it is clear that the path we choose now will define the next era of global relations. If this analysis resonated with you, share it, because the more people understand the stakes, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the future. Let's keep the conversation going. Stay tuned, because the next steps will define the answers. What will our legacy be? What kind of world do we want to leave behind?